Are you coming over?
Would it help for us to turn on my phone?
At this meeting, it'll be fine. If not, I'll be able to.
Someone was just saying how they can give their spiel without my turned on.
Should be okay.
Well, if we can have your attention, we appreciate, and I know that you do too, the opportunity to be here tonight. And this is, there have been more than once that we've been able to do this. And Dave Smith, studio archivist for the Walt Disney Company since 1970, has again agreed to come down to Disneyland and to share with us his expertise on Walt Disney and a little bit about these offices that were Walt Disney's at the studio just a few miles north of here. So with that, we'll turn the time over to Dave.
Thanks, Bruce. So much of these offices are really tied into my history with the company that I might as well start with that. And even going back a little earlier, before I was working for Disney, starting back in the 1960s. And I think the catalyst for all of this was Walt Disney's death on December 15th, 1966. I was working at the UCLA library. I had graduated from the University of California at Berkeley with my BA, and then got a master's in library science there. Went to Washington, D.C. under a special internship program at the Library of Congress and worked there for a year and a half. But I got homesick for California. I was born and raised in Pasadena, so I wanted to come back to California. So I was able to get a job at the UCLA library and worked there for about 5 years. Well, it was while I was working there that Walt died, and I'd always been a Disney fan. I'd enjoyed the Disney films. Growing up in Southern California, of course, I got to go to Disneyland a lot. I remember when Disneyland opened in 1955. I was 14 years old then, and I was so disappointed because my grandmother went to Disneyland before I ever got a chance to go to Disneyland. And she was raving about what a great place it was down here. And finally my family came, and I got to experience the park, and I was really thrilled with it, of course. And at that time I was delivering the Pasadena Star-News newspaper, and they had promotions every once in a while for their paper boys, where if you brought in 3 new subscriptions, you could get a passport to Disneyland. Now, this was a passport in the days of ticket books. I mean, passports were like gold in those days, because you could just flash this passport to get on any attraction. You wouldn't have to tear off your A, B, C, D tickets all the time. And for a teenager, that was really the top of the rung. So I remember once I was able to get 2 subscriptions, and I just could not find a third person to subscribe to the Star-News. And so I created this fictitious person. and I signed him up for the newspaper, and I paid for his first month. And then after the first month, he didn't want the paper anymore. But I mean, I don't think the newspaper was more than $1.75 or something a month, so it didn't cost me much. And out of that, I got this valuable passport to Disneyland. And I remember once in around 1956 or 7, coming here with my cousin, who was about the same age as me, and we were walking through the castle, and there was Walt Disney walking through the castle. And my first thought was, oh, I'd love to get his autograph. And I searched in my pockets, and of course I didn't have anything to write with. I did have a piece of paper, but I thought, well, I'll run into the nearest shop. Well, it was a magic shop there in the castle. And the only thing they had as a writing implement was a 2-foot-long pencil. So I bought this long pencil and went outside. And Walt had been accosted by them, by some other family, and he was posing for a picture with their kid. I asked him if he'd give me his autograph, and he refused. He apologized, but he said that if he started signing autographs, it just ruined his day, really, because then he'd get crowds around him and he never got his work done. So he said, write me at the studio and I'll send you an autograph, which he did, and I got the autograph. I went through the mail, so at least I have one. And of course, Walt Disney autographs are very valuable today. I mean, you're talking $800 to $1,000 just for Walt Disney signatures. So I treasure that one signature I got from Walt. I did take his picture that day. I did not have the foresight to stand next to him and get my picture taken. I was a shy teenager. I mean, I wasn't pushy. At least I didn't talk to him for a while. So that was my only chance to meet with Walt Disney. Well, jumping forward another 10 years or so, got me working at UCLA, and after Walt died, I thought that I really should do something to help memorialize Walt Disney. And one thing I'd done in library school was, and also at UCLA, had done some bibliographies. At UCLA, they published a bibliography that I'd done on the Monitor and the Merrimack warships, ironclads during the Civil War. And I thought, well, it'd be kind of fun to do a Disney bibliography, and I checked all the reference works to see if anybody had ever done one before, and nobody had. So I wrote to the Disney studio, and I asked them if they could open up any of their files for me to work on this bibliography. And I finally got a letter back from their publications department, and they said, sure, we'll help you out. And I started working on it in my spare time. Working in the library at UCLA, I'd work weekends sometimes, so I'd have days off during the week when I did that. And I'd sometimes use those days to go spend a day out at the Disney studio. And I was listing all the Disney films and the Disney television shows and all the Disney books and that sort of thing. Well, I got about halfway through the bibliography, and the people in the publications department felt that this was something that would be valuable to them. So they signed a contract with me and offered to buy my bibliography. I mean, it's rare to make any money off of a bibliography. So I don't remember what I got paid. It's something like $2,500 or something, but that was a lot of money for me in those days. And I was really impressed that Disney would do that, and so it gave me added incentive to keep working on this bibliography. And in fact, after I finished it, I didn't want to stop, so I did a supplement and I added sheet music and a few other categories. This got us up to about 1968, late 68, early 69. And about that time, the UCLA library, as do many different university research libraries in the country, they contacted the Disney studio and the Disney family and asked if Walt Disney's papers could be deposited at the UCLA library. Well, the people at Disney didn't really know how to reply to this. They didn't think that it would probably work, but they didn't really know what that meant. So they came out to UCLA to have a meeting with the head librarians, and they asked me to sit in on this meeting because I'd had this contact with Disney working on the bibliography. And out of the meeting, it became obvious that what the Disney people were thinking about was, sure, preserving all of their history, but it's something that UCLA couldn't possibly handle. I mean, there were several reasons for that. UCLA couldn't handle it because of the tremendous bulk of the material. They weren't just interested in saving the history of Walt Disney the person. They wanted to save the history of their whole organization. The second problem would have been the constant need for the Disney people to get into the material themselves. Here was a company, and probably more than any other company in the whole United States, that is constantly reusing its past. I mean, think of everything around Disneyland that's based on something that this company did many, many years ago. So there was this constant need of the company to get into the material. And then the third category, of course, is always a problem. If you have an ongoing profit-making corporation like Disney, you've got business secrets. You don't want people to know how to make an audio animatronics Abraham Lincoln. So there are things that you'd have to keep confidential in this material. So the librarians at UCLA suggested to the Disney representatives that were there at the meeting that they consider setting up an archives program at their own company, that a number of other companies in the United States had done so, and why doesn't Disney do this? So I was sitting in the back of the room and my ear perked up, and I thought, hey, that sounds like a fascinating job. So I went home that evening and sat down at my typewriter and wrote a letter to the Disney representatives that were there at that meeting and volunteered my services, essentially. What I suggested was, obviously you guys don't know what to do about setting up an archives. This is a good idea. This is something you should probably pursue. And since you are trying to find out how you're going to preserve your history, how about if I take a leave of absence from my job here at UCLA and I could be a consultant for you, and we could work up a program for setting up an archives. And I think this was just exactly what Disney wanted to hear. I mean, they wanted someone with some sort of background in library and archives work that could come and give them some advice as to what they could do with Walt's history. The offices that you see here had been closed up for several years, and they didn't know what to do with them. I mean, here were these closed offices at the studio. What do we do with these? They're wasting space. Should we open them up to show people? What should we do? I mean, they didn't know what to do. And so we got together and decided to go ahead with this consultant job. I got a 2-month leave of absence from UCLA and was hired as a consultant by Disney. This was in the fall of 1969, so starting around October. And I started, and they gave me an office in Walt Disney's office suite, the same suite that you see here. And they gave me a secretary from the publicity department to help me out. And I started going around and talking to people in the different departments of the company, trying to find out really the quantity and the quality of the material that had been saved by the company in all the different areas. I also went around and visited other companies. The company sent me on a business trip so I could go visit other corporate archives around the country. And there were a few that really sort of fit into the model that I was thinking might be good for Disney. One of them was the David Sarnoff Library of RCA Victor. RCA had this David Sarnoff Library they'd set up in Princeton, New Jersey. And this was a library set up both to honor and to hold the materials of their founder. The other types of libraries that I found were very similar to what I was going to suggest for the Disney organization were the presidential libraries. And I visited the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, and saw how they had both a museum and a research facility all in one building. And so out of this 2-month period of consultancy, I came up with a program for setting up a Walt Disney Archives and museum. I mean, they were both included in my original proposal. And I turned that proposal in the 1st of January, 1970, and went back to my job at UCLA. Well, it took them 6 months to think about this and make up their mind. Of course, I was biting my nails, wondering what they were going to decide to come up with. And by June, they decided, yes, they would like to start an archives program, and they asked me if I would come and head it up for them. So it was kind of fun. I sort of wrote my own job description. It was fun going to the head of personnel, called me in, and he said, I don't have any idea what we should pay archivists. So I got to set my own salary. So this was all kind of neat. But it was like being given an empty office and told, here, start. And nothing had been collected anywhere. It was still in part of the office suite here, which I'll describe for you in a minute. The first thing we did, of course, was start going around to the different departments and trying to make sure that the oldest stuff got saved. I mean, that was the stuff that was in the most danger of being lost. Every once in a while, I'd get a call from a department, and they say, we've got this storeroom here that we've got to turn into an office. So all the stuff that's in it's going out in the trash unless you want any of this stuff. So I'd go rushing over there and see what I needed for the archives. They also gave me what do they call it, a great grand master key to the studio, which opened every door in the whole studio. And you should have seen me snooping around in attics and basements and closets all around the studio, finding the most exciting things. I made friends with the janitors because they knew where everything was hidden around the studio. And they gave me tours of all these little closets and nooks and crannies where people had stored things in the past and then forgotten about them. And so we found a lot of the best material that we put in the archives, just snooping around in various storerooms around the studio. So anyway, that's how the archives got started. One of the first jobs that I had was to inventory Walt's offices. We knew that this valuable space at the Disney studio couldn't be maintained empty forever. And they knew that someday they'd have to take this stuff out. So what we decided to do was to go through these offices and completely inventory everything in here, and also to take a photographer in here and completely photograph the offices from every angle. And you know, what my ulterior motive was reproducing it at Disneyland, and that was because of the Truman Library. If any of you have been to the Reagan Library or the Nixon Library, what do they have there? The Oval Office. That's been sort of the keystone of almost all of the presidential libraries. They will reproduce the Oval Office. And it's fascinating for the visitors to the presidential libraries to see the room in which this famous person worked. And I always felt that would be kind of fun, someplace to display the offices where Walt Disney worked. So we carefully inventoried this. A lot of times I was in here by myself, and you don't know how eerie that was for someone. How old was I then? My late 20s. Always been a Disney fan. Suddenly have this key and given access to Walt's office, and here I am sitting at his desk, and nobody else is around. I mean, it was really eerie. But we did our inventory. We listed everything that we could. We completely photographed the offices from all angles. And around 1972, they decided that they were going to take the offices out of the studio, and they didn't yet have this Walt Disney Story planned, though they had a glimmer of a hope that someday they would do a Walt Disney Story at Disneyland and at Walt Disney World. So we carefully packed up all of the material in the offices with the eventuality that someday we would have this reproduction that we would be able to do. That meant carefully wrapping and packing every single thing here in the office. What they did even was to take the wall paneling off the walls. This is the original wall paneling from the Disney studio up in Burbank. About the only thing that's different is they replaced the carpet, it was soiled. They did reupholster a couple of the pieces of furniture using the same material whenever they could. But essentially, this is an exact reproduction of what you had at the Disney studio. And while we were taking the offices apart, I remember at one point asking one of the supervisors that was there helping us if we could have the original telephone instruments. And he said, no, those belong to the phone company. You can't have those. And when he went out of the room, one of the workmen that was helping with the moving and packing went over to the phone and yanked it out of the wall and handed it to me. And he says, what he doesn't know won't hurt him. So we have original telephone instruments that Walt had in his office. So it's down to that exact. When they decided to build the Walt Disney Story here, which opened in 1973, they built it to, of course, the exact dimensions of the studio's 2 offices. The one thing they had to add was the door in the back of this office so you could get out of it. And of course, they had to put windows on this side so that people could see in. And of course, there was furniture on this side. So it looks a little different than it did, but I came down here myself, and we brought the furniture in, and then we had all the boxes piled in the middle of the floor with all of the books and the figurines and everything in it. And I opened these boxes, and I had the photographs in one hand, and I was carefully placing all of the objects back in exactly the same location. And when I finished and sat down in that desk chair again, it was really, again, a very eerie feeling because this was so exactly the same as it had been up at the studio. I think Walt would be very surprised to see this and realize that his whole office had just magically flown down here to Disneyland and looked exactly the same as it did up there at the studio. Let me briefly explain before we go into the offices, what the whole layout of the wing here that these offices were part of. The animation building at the studio where this office was located on the 3rd floor is divided into wings. This was done so that there's eight wings, 4 on either side. And this was done so that all of the offices would have outside light. Walt wanted this for his artists so that they would have natural light coming in when they were working and not have to have artificial light all the time. Walt's offices were in the 3H wing, which is 3rd floor, northeast corner animation building. And he had the whole wing. I mean, nobody else had a whole wing, but Walt did. These 2 offices were at the very end of the wing. Now, look at the picture outside the window there. Yours is different. You have to look at this picture. That is the animation building. So of course that is not what Walt would have seen out of his window. And in fact, it's even cut strangely, so that's not exactly the way it looks. But the 3rd floor on one of those wings would have been where Walt's offices were and would have covered the whole end of the wing. So this would be the width of one of the wings of the studio. Okay, if these were the end of the wing, right over here, right about at the end of the window, was a door. That door went into Walt's secretary's office. Tommy Wilk was his last secretary. That's her desk right there. A small office right there. Okay, next to that was another small office, and this was for his receptionist. He had both a receptionist and a secretary. And it was in the receptionist area where he had a little display case with a whole row of all of his Oscars up there. It was really intimidating for any visitors that came to see Walt Disney. There's 30 Oscars or something up on the counter. But he had this display case for his major awards. Then from there were like 2 other small offices, one of which was his miniatures room, where he kept his miniature collection. And there were bookcases, glass front bookcases, floor to ceiling, and these were just filled around the walls of this whole room with his miniature collection. And you see a bit of the miniature collection over there, but a tremendous amount in this one room. Lots of little room settings of different styles of furniture, and really fascinating stuff. Of course, you can't imagine the difficulty in inventorying every single piece in the miniatures room. That took forever. But anyway, that was a fun collection. The room next to that was the room that they had given us for our offices to start the archives. So I was there all alone to start with, and after a few years I finally got a secretary. Now we have 8. We have 5 in the archives and 3 in the photo library, which we also run. Okay, besides the rooms that were on that side, now we look on this side. There was a door about at the end there, again at the end of the window, that went into a hallway, a little hallway where there was a closet, and then there was a little bedroom. Walt had a little day bed in there. That's where he had his neck treatments when he had his neck problems. In fact, when I was doing the inventory, a lot of the medical equipment was still in that room that he used for his I don't know, getting tensions on his back or whatever they were doing with it. I don't know what all this equipment was. We finally gave it to the hospital across the street. And off that room was a bathroom, a little bathroom. Down from that was another little hall going back to the receptionist's office. And there was another bathroom off of that hall, which was for his guests that were visiting the office. So that essentially was the layout of the wing. That wing now is being used by Roy Disney. Roy has this office, this is his main office. It was completely remodeled after they took all of Walt's furnishings out. They moved the walls, and it doesn't look quite the same anymore, but I think you could recognize it. Card Walker was in there for a while, then Ron Miller had that for his office, and then Michael Eisner had it for his office until the Team Disney building was built. And when that was built, he moved into Team Disney, and Roy went into this office. So this room they now use as a conference room. So essentially that's what's happened with the offices now. Now, we're going to go inside, and I'll give you a little more detailed description of the actual things that are there in the office. Please don't touch anything. If you have questions about something, that's fine. If you want me to open something or hold something up, we can do that. But let's not handle any of the things that are in there. Bruce, do you want to do some questions out here before we go in?
Or? Do you have some questions that you want to ask before we go to the offices? Then what we're going to do is go into the offices. We'll have everyone actually come through this door and then into the formal office first, where you can take a seat, and then Dave will probably stand behind Walt's desk and give us a tour of that office and have an opportunity to ask questions there. From there, we'll have you file into the outer office. Here is working office. We'll have you sit in the furniture and on the floor, and then Dave will stand behind this desk and explain things in this office, and we'll ask questions there.
If you have any general questions that aren't specific about either of these 2 rooms, let's do those now. And then when we get inside, if you have specific questions about the things in the offices, then we can talk about those inside.
I have a question.
Yes.
Of all that other equipment, like the medical equipment and the miniatures and all, is that stuff, do you still have all that?
Yes. In most cases, there were some pieces of furniture that were too large that we didn't keep. By the way, I didn't mention, but we do have photographs of what was on these 2 walls, and we have them inside there, so you'll be able to see what the full office looked like. There was, for example, a couch right here. I mean, this is a coffee table. When you have sitting in front of a coffee table, his couch usually. So that's what was here. It was in a little alcove. And of course, we had no space to store a couch, and so we got rid of that. We do have 3 chairs left in the office that came from Walt's office suite. And we still have, of course, all the things that were in his file cabinets and cupboards and all that sort of thing. We've saved all of that material. So we didn't get rid of much other than that medical equipment. That was about it. Yeah.
We're aware of Lucille Martin as being one of Walt's secretaries or receptionists. When did she occupy space, and actually where was she at?
She wasn't his secretary, that was Tommy Wilt, but she was sort of the assistant secretary, or maybe she was receptionist. But she started, I think, around 64, so it was a couple of years before he died. So she wasn't there a long time before he passed away, but she certainly has had longevity in the company, working for Walt, and then eventually Ron Miller, and then eventually Michael Eisner. She's gone through all of our CEOs. Probably knows more about the company than anybody that's there. Anything else?
How about a brief history of Walt's life?
Brief history? How brief you want it? A 5-minute version or a half-an-hour version?
The 5-minute version.
5-minute version. Walt was born December 5th, coming up pretty soon, 1901, in Chicago, Illinois. Not in Spain, as some people say. His parents were Elias and Flora Disney. Elias was a building contractor, built some homes there in Chicago, including the home in which they lived. He was a very religious man, built the church they attended, and they attended the Congregational Church in Chicago. He was occasionally even lay preacher in the church. He was not pleased with the atmosphere around Chicago. Some neighbor kids had gotten arrested for stealing a car or something recently, and he thought it'd be nice to have a more wholesome area where he could bring up his children. So he thought about the Missouri area. He had a brother, Robert Disney, who was living in Marceline, Missouri. And Robert persuaded him to come down and look at some land there in Marceline. And Elias did find a farm that he would like to buy, and so he purchased this farm in Marceline, Missouri. So when Walt was about 4 or 5 years old, they moved down to Marceline, Missouri, and had a little farm there. And Walt and Flora and their 5 kids, there were 4 brothers and a sister in the family, were running this farm. Eventually, the 2 older brothers, and they were quite a bit older than Walt and Roy, got tired of working on the farm, and I guess Elias was quite a disciplinarian, and they chafed under this, and so eventually they packed up and ran away one night, left poor Walt and Roy there to do all the work. Now, there was even a lot of years between Walt and Roy. Roy was born in 1893, and Walt in 1901, so you got 8 years there between them. So when Walt was 5, Roy was 13, so you had this sort of big brother looking after little brother type thing, and this was sort of the atmosphere that stayed with them throughout their lives. It was always big brother and little brother. They stayed there on the farm until Elias had health problems, couldn't operate the farm anymore, and so around 1910 they moved to Kansas City, Missouri, and Elias bought a newspaper delivery route, and Roy and Walt were 2 of his delivery boys. So that was Walt's first job, essentially, other than working on the farm, was delivering the newspaper every morning. And, of course, it wasn't easy in Kansas City, especially in the winter. And Elias insisted the paper be put up on the porch and behind the screen, and it was hard work for these guys. Naturally, they didn't get paid. So they had a hard life. I mean, it was really hard on the guys growing up. Walt went to school in Kansas City, went to Baptist school, graduated there in the 8th grade. And his younger sister, Flora, was in the same year of school. Either she skipped a grade or two, or he hadn't started as soon as he should have, because they were both in the same graduating class in the 8th grade. Elias and Flora decided to move to Chicago at this time. Walt remained in Kansas City that summer, worked on the railroad, selling pop and newspapers on the train. But he eventually moved up to Chicago also, and entered McKinley High School, 9th grade. And that was the only year of high school he ever attended. He never went any farther than that 1 year of high school at McKinley High. The reason was World War I came along, and he wanted to go join up. His brothers were in the Army, the Navy. He wanted to do his part for his country too, but he was too young. He was only 16. He had to be 18 to get in the military, so he couldn't get in. But he did find there was a Red Cross unit forming that would take 17-year-olds, and he figured he could manage that. So after his mother had signed his passport application, he did a little forgery on it, changed the birth year, so he was able to get into the Red Cross and was sent over to France right at the end of the war. Got there about a week after the armistice was signed, and drove an ambulance and did other cleanup chores as the troops were getting ready to come home. Stayed there 9 months, came back to Kansas City, decided he'd like to go into business. And filmmaking intrigued him, animation intrigued him. Got his first job with the Kansas City Film Ad Company, making slides for movie theaters, like ladies, please take off your hats, things like that. Please no talking, no smoking, things like that. But it got him started, and in his spare time, he played around with a little bit of animation. In 1922, he set up his own little company, which was called Laugh-O-Gram Films, and they made some modernized versions of fairy tales in animation. Unfortunately, the company that bought these cartoons from him paid him a $100 deposit and then went bankrupt. So, owing Walt $11,000 that he'd already spent to make the movies. So, of course, that caused his fledgling company to go bankrupt too. And that was his incentive to leave Kansas City and come out to California. He realized that Kansas City was not really the center of the motion picture industry, and if he wanted to be work in the movies, he better come out to California, where the movie industry was. And so in July of 1923, he moved out to California. And one of the last films that he made back at the Laugh-O-Gram Studios was Alice's Wonderland, which was a little cartoon with a live girl that acted in a cartoon world. And he used this as what we might call today a pilot film, to send around to distributors so that they could buy a series of these Alice comedies, as he called them. And Margaret Winkler, a distributor in New York, decided that she would like to distribute a series of these Alice comedies. So she signed a contract with Walt, and the date of that contract, October 16th, 1923, is the date we use as the beginning of the Walt Disney Company. So our 75th anniversary, of course, is coming up next year. So he was in business. Roy was recuperating from tuberculosis that he'd gotten in the Navy during the war. And I guess he must have been pretty well cured by then, because he left the hospital and went and joined Walt. And as a partnership, they started the company. It was first called the Disney Brothers Cartoon Studio. Within a very short time, Roy convinced Walt that his name should be on it, because he was the creative one of the two, and so it became the Walt Disney Studio and Walt Disney Productions eventually. And of course, the Alice comedies went on for about 4 years. 1927, they switched from that to Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, made a year of Oswald cartoons, getting away from this combination of live action and animation, which Walt was getting a little tired of. And then, of course, Mickey Mouse came along in 1928, and I assume you pretty much know the history of the Disney company since that time. But, the 20s and 30s were pretty much the heyday of Mickey Mouse. 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs came out, of course, and that really turned the company around. You couldn't make much money off of short cartoons, but suddenly with a full-length feature, and such a popular full-length feature. Here was a movie that cost $1.5 million in 1937, but it made $8.5 million during that first release, and that was at a time when kids were paying a dime to get into the theater. So you can imagine that that's the equivalent of a $200 or $300 million movie today, and it became the highest-grossing movie of all time. It wasn't until Gone with the Wind came along a few years later that it was finally surpassed. So people forget what an impressive impact Snow White had when it first came out. So that really changed the company's whole outlook. I mean, they continued making the short cartoons for another decade and a half, but it was the features that really made the money for the studio. And of course, Fantasia and Pinocchio both came out in 1940, and 41 was Dumbo, 42 was Bambi. That was really the golden age of the Disney films. The war came along, of course, and slowed things up for a while, but we got back to full-length features again with Cinderella in 1950, and Alice in Wonderland in 1951, Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp. Of course, then Disneyland came along in 1955, and that sort of changed Walt and his whole way of doing business, because now he had to spread himself a little thinner than he was before. He couldn't spend all of his time supervising the animated features. He had to supervise Disneyland. At the same time, they've gone on to television, so you've got him having to supervise that too. You had the nature films being made. You had live action features by now. So there was a lot of new things that Walt was getting involved with. And the one indication you could see of that in the animated films was how long it took to make Sleeping Beauty. Sleeping Beauty came out 4 years after Lady and the Tramp, and that was the longest period between any of our features. But then he started getting back in the swing of things, and every couple of years after that, we had another animated feature. And he was finally really deemed as, I mean, he felt he was really successful by the end of his life, really. I mean, once you had Disneyland and the merchandising and the television and the live action features and the animated features, suddenly he was getting a comfortable living. He wasn't having to continually pour all of his money back into the company to keep trying these new things. He was an innovator. He was always trying new things, and he was always not listening to all the critics that tried to tell him that, no, you don't want to do these things. And I think that was why he was so successful. He was a genius at knowing what the public wanted in the way of family entertainment. That's more than a 5-minute history.